Welcome to the Mercy Cast, where we're learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. In 2019, I wrote a book called Vulnerable, Rethinking Human Trafficking. And I remember being on cloud nine. I was excited to be able to put my biggest passion on pages for people to read. And I'll never forget the book launch. I'm there with 70 of my closest friends, and we're all celebrating this accomplishment. This was one of the top 5 moments of my life. And then 30 hours later, I'm landing in Chicago, Illinois to do a promotional tour. And I get a call from my new roommate who'd only been in the apartment for like 24 hours. And he said, "Hey man, there's smoke. Our apartment's on fire." In just a little over a day, I went from cloud 9 to the basement. I lost basically everything. And though our apartment didn't burn up, the smoke damage rendered it inhospitable. We could not live in the apartment. And so now I'm functionally homeless. And I'm thinking to myself, why did I write a book on vulnerability? Why did I write a book on weakness? This was a terrible mistake. I should have written a book on being awesome. I should have written a book on having it together. And then maybe some things would have broken my way. But it led me down a road that was very hard. Because for me, I've never wanted to admit weakness. I've always wanted to shore up my strengths. I've always wanted to show people that I have it all together. And here's the kicker. They all know that you don't. And we think at some level that they're blind to this. And I think the only person blind to it is us. And so for me, learning that my greatest strength could be found in my weakness was like a Copernican revolution in my thinking. It changed everything. Because whether we want to believe it or not, we are weak. We are dependent, and that's okay. Eric has never wanted to show his weakness his whole life. He's always wanted to appear strong and perfect. But ultimately, like the rest of us, he wasn't very good at it. Today, I'm joined by Eric Shoemaker. He's been a pastor for over 20 years. He's an author and a Johnny Cash fanatic. And his forthcoming book, The Good Gift of Weakness, God's Strength Made Perfect in the Story of Redemption, is what we're going to talk about today. Eric, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Hey, Raleigh, it's good to be with you. I always enjoy hanging out with you, and we don't do it enough.
No, we don't, but we should. We should do it more. What I've liked about you, Eric, is you've always been an honest person, and for me, that's a big deal to me. I'm not a big fan of inauthenticity, even when I'm being inauthentic. I'm like, I hate myself right now. This is the worst. Be real, be honest. And I think that has become a virtue in our society that we want people to be authentic. But I've always loved how, for you, it always comes from a genuine place. You are trying to walk with Jesus and you're trying to walk with others. You're trying to live the Christian life. And in so doing, you probably noticed that some of what we project may not be who we are. How did you recognize in your own life that you were projecting strength, but deep down you knew that you were weak?
That is a great question. And it's funny that you would describe me as an honest person, because while I try to be, what do you call that? Imposter syndrome? Yeah, right. Such a real thing.
It is a real thing.
I think I know growing up from a very young age, I think I actually mentioned this in the book. I think I was in first grade when my parents took me. We lived in a small town, 1,000 people, went to a little school, K through 12, all in the same building, 450 students total, K through 12. And so they took me to the high school musical, which is if you went to a rural school, you might know what this is like, but the stage is in the wall at the one end of the gymnasium. And so we're in this gym watching the high school musical at South Pacific. And I was, just enthralled with this lead character. I probably wasn't even following the storyline, but they're singing and everybody's clapping. And when he comes out at the end for curtain call, he's the one who gets the most applause. Like, everyone was going crazy for the leads. And I remember thinking then and there, that's who I'm going to be. I am going to be the guy who gets the most applause.
Yeah.
And I tried to run for every office and do every activity. And you learn in stages that you're not all that in a bag of chips. I remember like running for offices in high school and getting elected to student government and then realizing you can't actually do anything that you promised that you got elected on. Or even just getting to college, I was a big fish in a small pond in my high school in a small town. And you get to university and everybody there has accomplished all the all-state awards and every contest you ever won, and nobody cares. And they're all better than you because they've actually been working hard at music and drama and all those things. And you just realize you're not as great as you thought you were. And that is a shock to the system.
Eric, what do you think drives us to want to be the guy who gets the most applause? Because I think that is insanely relatable for us.
At the core of it, as Christians, we understand that to be sin. In the Garden of Eden, we weren't content to have God possess the knowledge of good and evil, and we trust him and live by faith. We wanted that for ourselves. And that has been our pursuit ever since, is to try to make ourselves God. We live in the fear of death. And if we can get famous, then we have this perception of we live on beyond ourselves. We have this idolatry, I think, that we believe that if we can accomplish things, that if we can get the most applause, if we can be famous and rich and powerful, then life will be good. And we can somehow escape the curse and be our own saviors. And if we're lucky enough or maybe unlucky enough to get there and accomplish some things, we quickly find out how empty that is, and that living the dream can sometimes actually be living the nightmare.
And this idea of living the dream, for a lot of us, we think, oh, well, this is new. This is post-Enlightenment thinking. People weren't doing this in medieval times. This desire to put yourself first, this desire to be accepted by everyone, to be famous, this hunger even, this is a new thing. And honestly, it's not. You just said it. It's grounded in what happened in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3.
Yeah.
And in some way, we have been jockeying for position as long as humanity has been around. We always want to get that approval from others when ultimately it's the approval of another that we need, but we seek it from everyone else. In my book, Vulnerable, I have a chapter 4, where I talk about a biblical theology of vulnerability, because I hadn't seen it treated before. And so I give a chapter to it, and it's my favorite chapter in the book. And I talk about how weakness, or perceived weakness, how vulnerability is not a plan B. Because oftentimes we think, well, they sinned in the garden and now we're weak. Well, no, you were created to be dependent, but sin did exacerbate it. Tell me a little bit more of how that started in the first chapters of Genesis and how it continues now.
Yeah. Well, that is one of the first thing that we see in Genesis is that God is not weak. In the beginning, God. He depends on no one. He comes from no one. He needs no one. He's entirely self-sufficient, and he creates everything simply by speaking. That is power. He has no vulnerability. He has no weakness. He has no need. But every single other thing that exists because he created it. And so immediately we all depend on God simply to exist. And then he is giving us our purpose. I'm going to create you in my image, so you depend on me to be created. And I'm going to give you dominion over all the creatures of the earth, and I'm going to command you to exercise dominion as my image bearers. So we're dependent on God for our purpose. And then he says, I'm going to create this garden for you to live in. So we're dependent on God for our place. And then he says, I'm going to, he plants a garden, and he says, you can eat of all these trees except for this one, because he made us with this need to eat. And so we're dependent upon God for our provision. If we don't eat, we die. And God designed us that way to remind us that we are always vulnerable to starvation. Like if you don't eat, in a matter of a few days, you die. And then he says, you're so weak that it's absolutely not good for the man to be alone because he's incapable of accomplishing the purpose that I've given to him. And so we depend on him for our partnerships. I'm alliterating all this. I'm a Baptist.
I was going to say something. I'm glad you got to it first.
Yeah. Well, the poem is coming. So, so then he creates, like, you have to do this in cooperation with other people. And all of that is good. Like, after he creates the woman for the man, then God saw that it was very good. So we're created with these weaknesses that are inherent to what it means to be the creation and not the creator. And in God's eyes, it's very good. And so that's what I call that our natural weakness in the book, the weaknesses that we're created with, in opposition to, are differentiated from what I would call moral weakness or consequential weakness, the weaknesses that we have because of the fall. We get sick, we sin, or we die. Those are consequences of the fall. And those are the consequences that are bad, and we need to be redeemed from them. And we can't even do that ourselves.
So we're dependent on God for our purpose, our place, our provision, and our partnerships. I love that, because that does show that this weakness is a plan A. This is how we were created. Yep. We were created to be dependent on God. And I love how you differentiate that between, the created order and then this idea of moral weakness, natural weakness versus moral weakness. I love that, because what I've noticed as, just growing up, I remember talking to people about my faith, and especially if I talked to someone who had some years on them, if they had some wisdom, if they had some city miles on them where they had seen some things in their lives, a lot of those people who weren't believers would say things like, I wanted to believe in God. I truly want to believe in God, but my wife died of cancer, and why would God take her? Or why are these children starving in this war-torn land? Why are people suffering? How could a good God allow that? As you have given this treatment in your book to this idea of natural and moral weakness, what does the Bible say about why these terrible things happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I love what you said about this wasn't us being weak wasn't plan B. I like to say about our natural weaknesses that it's not a bug in the system. It's by design. And, when the whole fall happens because we decide that we think we're strong, in Adam and Eve plucking that fruit and eating it, they're saying, there's another need, our need for protection. God gave them a warning. Don't eat from this tree because it'll kill you. They couldn't know that apart from God revealing that. And at some point, they look at that tree, and Eve, being deceived, says, you know what? I think I can know better than God, or I think I can know as much as God. And Adam seems to think, with eyes wide open, takes the fruit and is saying, I think I can eat the fruit, and I'm strong enough not to suffer the consequence that God is going to bring on me, that he's promised for that, which is death. So the whole fall has to do with us thinking that we're stronger in our wisdom, in every way, strong enough to be God and go toe to toe with him and be his equal. And the rest of history is God showing us what folly that is, because immediately you have Cain and Abel being born, and one is worshiping God in faith and the other's not, and God is showing regard for Abel. And so Cain kills him, and Cain and his descendants are a great picture of people who love their strength in the world. Cain is supposed to be a wanderer on earth, marked by God, and he goes off and he builds a city, because what's he doing? He's thinking that if I can build a city, I can build cities for protection. There's safety in numbers.
Right.
And so, lest anyone kill me, instead of trusting God that there'll be a curse on them, I'm going to go build a city. And his descendants just grow in their wickedness, their mistreatment of other people. Because, the third category of that I discuss in the book of weakness is relative weakness, that in relation to each other, some of us are stronger and weaker than other people in the world. In the end, we're all weak. But for some of us, it's more apparent in some areas than in others. And those who have physical or political or financial strength, in our folly, trusting in ourselves, we think that we can afflict those who are weaker than us and get away with it. If I pick on a widow, an orphan, a child, a disabled person, someone who's less intelligent than me, they can't knock my teeth out because they don't have the strength. And so I can do what serves me at their expense and get away with it. And that's half, at least, of all the evil we suffer in the world. And the other half is the curse, Well, that's all the curse, but there's the natural consequences of the curse where, we depended, I think, upon being able to eat from this tree of life that we don't know a lot about, but it seems like if you eat from it, then you keep living. And now we're outside of the garden, outside of God's presence. We can't eat that. And our bodies are in this constant state of decay. It's, cancer is a tragedy and a sad thing. You mentioned the person who says, I can't believe in God because my wife died of cancer, but we're all dying. At the end of the day, a peaceful death at 95 is still a tragedy because it's not natural. It's a crisis for us because we're so weak now in our sin, we can't live forever. And we weren't made to die. So at its source is sin, which is our pride, thinking we're stronger than God and that we can manipulate successfully other people in this world.
That's so hard. That's so hard to take because a lot of us, we want to pretend that sin is not a part of our daily lives. We want to pretend that at our core, we have it all together. If I do it perfectly, then I will be loved. Mm-hmm. And it's very akin to that whisper that Adam heard in the garden from the serpent. Your eyes will be opened. You will know all things. And now on this side of Genesis 3, we're living in brokenness. At our best and at our core, oftentimes we're just pretending. Mm-hmm. As you talk about this idea of death and how all of us are dying, I just was thinking about how I was even called into this anti-trafficking / vulnerability world. I'm sitting there in the basement of my friend's house. He's upstairs dying of cancer. This is one of my best friends in the world, David. We were seminary roommates. I'll never forget, I'm sitting there and I'm running from a calling right now because I had sensed that God was calling me to this anti-trafficking thing. There was an outward call. People were coming alongside of me saying, I think God's called you to this. And I'm like, I don't even know what it is. Like, how could I be called to this? And my friend's upstairs, I'm downstairs, and I'm just dealing with a lot of pain. My job, I was a college minister at the time, and that job was being defunded. A bunch of us were looking for work, and I was in a relationship that ended. And then my friend's upstairs, and I was reading a book called The Last Enemy by Michael Whitmer. And I'll paraphrase it, but there's this chapter in it. He said, you are going to die. Everyone in your family is going to come along and they're going to come to your funeral and they're going to eat egg salad sandwiches. They're going to talk about you for a little bit. Then they're going to leave. Then in time, they're going to die. Then the people that knew them, they're going to die. Within 3 to 4 generations, you're all but forgotten. And in some weird way, that ministered to me. Mm-hmm. In some weird way, the acknowledgement of my own limitations freed me to realize, yeah, I have an expiration date. So why am I letting fear keep me from the thing that I know I want to do? Not just the thing I'm called to do. It's the thing I want to do. I just don't know if I have permission to do it. And in that moment, realizing that death is always nipping at our heels, it actually freed me to love and be loved by God. It freed me to kind of rip off the Band-Aid and be like, God, I need you. Mm-hmm. And it freed me to love others. And so I think when we experience death, we're going to go either one way or the other. We're going to run towards the divine or we're going to run away from God. And I love how you spoke to that.
I think that is such a powerful thing. Like, embracing our weakness, and that the second most, well, the weakest that a human body can be is dead. There is no greater weakness than that, and we're all heading towards it. The greatest weakness, of course, is hell, eternal damnation,
Right.
which is a death and then a death and then a death and a death and a death. But I remember that point as a kid. It might have been around the time when my grandfather, who I was close to, died, and thinking about the fact that there's going to come a moment for every single one of us that we're going to die. We might know it comes, it might hit us by surprise, and we don't know it's there at all, but it's unavoidable. We cannot stop it unless Christ returns before we die. We're going to die. We're going to take a final breath. And it's fascinated me, just my curiosity is like, what is that like? No one's done it and come back and told us what it's like. I don't think really done it. They didn't interview Lazarus for the Gospel of Luke. And so it's such a mystery to us what that's like. But as a there's so many ways you can go with that. You can, I think from a secular standpoint, you can go, yeah, we're all going to die. And we could come up with, so what? Like, so, why not have an island stocked with trafficked children that I can invite all my rich friends to, and we can enjoy ourselves and I can get really wealthy off of it because we're all going to die. What's it matter? But knowing that we're going to die and we have an existence beyond the grave, and as Christians, we know we've been saved from judgment, and Christ has promised us a resurrection in bodies that are imperishable and eternal and indestructible in a world where there is no pain, there is no tears, there is no sadness. That frees us to go, I can do this ministry to traffic people, even if it's hard and even if it's painful, because what I really want and long for is promised beyond the grave. And I think in the same way, just grasping our utter weakness at everything, we're far, far weaker than we ever understand in any endeavor. But to know that God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble.
Yeah.
Our weakness it's the backdrop against which God shows off his strength. And faith in itself is a confession of weakness. I can't save myself, but I trust that Christ has done all the work to save me. God only saves weak people. If you can't confess that you're weak, you can't be saved. But when we can grasp that, we can go into anything and go, God, I don't have a clue what I'm doing. And I am a fool to even think that I would have any ability to do it apart from you. And that's where God loves to show up and go, all right, you boast about your weakness because when you're weak, then you're strong. That's the conclusion that Paul comes to.
And you tie this idea of relative weakness and fear of limitation together when you talk about, well, if I'm going to die, then why not exploit people?
Mm-hmm.
Because I may be weak, but these people may be more weak. I may be vulnerable, but I'm a little less vulnerable than these people. So I'm going to exploit them for my own self-redemption.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've found is when we try to save ourselves and we try to bolster our own vulnerability on our own, it's always going to lead to exploitative behavior. Whether it's you going to pornography for comfort, that is in and of itself an exploitative behavior. And it's something that we don't have to do, but we do because maybe there are wounds. But at the end of the day, the person on the other side of the screen may not want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're doing that, oftentimes when we're trying to save ourselves, we can go down these roads where we inevitably hurt others.
Mm.
And I'm not trying to soften it, but I think to make your point, when we run from our limitation, it's not going to bode well for ourselves or other people in the end. But God has come on his rescue mission to redeem us. And what I love, especially with reference to this idea of relative weakness, is throughout the Old Testament and even in the New, God is always identifying with those most vulnerable and then challenging his people to join him in that. And he'll say things like, "You were slaves once in Egypt. Now love the sojourner." He's always grounding our love for those who are more vulnerable than us in his redemption of us, in his saving us in spite of our inability to save ourselves, in him saving us in spite of our weakness.
Yeah, that's great. And our worst weakness as Christian, or not as Christians, as human beings, is our sin. Like that's while we were ungodly, Christ died for us. And Romans also says, while we were still weak, while we were helpless, Christ gave his life for us. And so sin is the ultimate weakness that we can't free ourselves from, that we can't do anything about. We just try as hard as we want to reform ourselves. We just can't do it. Paul describes us as walking according to the pattern of the world. We're slaves to sin, and we're slaves to Satan, the prince of this world. Sinners are people who are being trafficked by Satan and their flesh and their sinful desires. And Jesus loves us enough to say, "Let my people go. I'm going to free you from that sin, even if you don't want to be set free. I'm going to come take you out of it and make you new." And I think when we experience that just has to transform us and how we view people who are enslaved in any kind of situation.
Well, there's that idea of the mud pies versus the holiday at sea that C.S. Lewis talked about, how in our sin, we would rather be in an alley making mud pies when there's this offer for this holiday at sea and we're not taking it because we don't even know that could be our reality. We're settling for what we can muster. And I think when we get to this point where our weakness is all we know, we in our own power try to make it our strength. And so we decide we're strong and we project strength. But in your book, you talk about how in our weakness, we are able to access God's strength. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So that's the storyline of the whole Bible. Just go look at, so the promise in Genesis is the seed of the woman's going to be born to crush the head of the serpent. And it's going to happen as he's going to deliver a mortal blow to the head of the serpent as the serpent delivers a mortal blow to his heel. Getting struck in the heel by a serpent is, if it's venomous, you die. And that's the picture Genesis paints is salvation is going to come through someone who dies. And then you follow the storyline along and you look at Abraham and Sarah or their children, particularly through barren women who are married to these patriarchs. And what are they trying to do? Well, man, God's not keeping his promise to give us offspring. And so I have an idea. I have a plan. Why don't you go sleep with my slave? And then we can get offspring for ourselves. And every time God's saying, nope, that's not how it's going to happen. It's going to come through your own offspring. And so we have these people trying to think, well, I can be strong and I can figure it out. And God's going, no, I'm going to take the weakest of circumstances. And that's the line through which my Redeemer is going to come. You have this period of Judges where you have these sort of superhero-like people doing these extravagant feats. Where's the Messiah coming from? Well, there's this Moabite woman named Ruth in this obscure village of Bethlehem going out by herself into a barley field. And she's going to meet a kind man who is an old bachelor, probably because his mother was Rahab the prostitute and no one would let their daughter marry him. And so you have these kind of weak people just faithfully trusting God and taking refuge under his wings. And the line of David's going to come through that. When is Israel blessed? It's when you have a king like David who says, you can't mock my God. And even though I'm not big enough to wear armor, my God's big enough to kill you and he'll help me do it. And I'm going to march out in the field and slay this giant. But as soon as the kings start thinking anything great of themselves, they start trying to build their own kingdoms. And the storyline of the entire Bible is that at every single turn, God is working through the weakest parts of his people to show off his strength. Because the story of creation was always about us as those in his image displaying his glory to the world as his image bearers. And that's what God delights to do. And the call that he's given us is to turn away from our sins and to trust that Jesus lived for us and died for us and rose for us, and to find our life entirely in the person and work of somebody else and not in ourselves. That's how God calls us to live, and that's how God loves to show off his strength. One of the chapters I loved on writing about weakness in the Christian life was looking at Paul in 2 Corinthians, where they want to dismiss him because he's not like these super apostles, which is the term that he uses. And they are the super apostles are these skilled orators who have the chops to do a big speaking circuit. They're the big stage, big conference speakers there in Corinth, and they can fetch really high speaking fees. And Paul said, and they're critiquing Paul because he doesn't speak eloquently like they do. And he, instead of commanding a fee, which he even says he has a right to do, he intentionally says, no, I'm not going to charge anybody. I'm going to make tenths. And in that culture, like, your worth as a speaker was found in how much you could get paid and how eloquent you were. And we even hear it today. Don't give away your ministry for free, because you need to be charging people, because
Absolutely.
because then you show that your work has worth. That's what Paul was hearing. And Paul is saying, no, I refuse to operate on those terms, lest the gospel be made void. Because Paul knows, and you can hear the Christian coaches saying it today, oh man, you've got to know your audience. You've got to know the context that you're walking into. If you're not charging, and if you're not being eloquent as an influencer on Instagram, people aren't going to listen to you because they want to see something polished and beautiful, and they want a price that reflects its quality. And Paul goes, well, as soon as I do those things, when I provide those things, if people will then listen to me and believe, then they've believed the gospel of eloquence and speaker fees and polish, and they're not believing the gospel of a really repulsive and ugly Messiah hanging on a cross that looks the opposite of everything we tell people is strength. And so Paul says, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to play that game. I'm going to brag about how weak and shameful my ministry looks, so that the only thing you can hope in after you've heard me is Jesus.
That reminds me of a time where I had multiple people tell me when Let My People Go was getting off the ground. We had written a handbook, which is now available for free on our website. And I'll never forget this person who, they're leading a nonprofit. It's worldwide, and they're absolutely crushing it. They're doing a wonderful job. And he sat down with me and gave me some time, and he said, what's the best thing you have to offer? What is something that could really help people in a way that they could just connect with it? Consulting and stuff aside, what? And I'm like, well, our handbook. And he goes, make it free, give it away. Because that is almost gospel thinking, because that's counterintuitive to the scarcity hoarding mindset that so many of us have. Like, we've got to manage and protect what we have. We need to project strength. But when you are free, you're able to say, okay, I can give this away because I know that I'm going to be provided for, because I'm not the one who's in charge of providing for me. And I think so many of us, as we're learning to grapple with weakness, there can be a moment in our lives where we see our weakness as the key to our greatest strength, because accepting our weakness not only can lead to salvation, accepting our weakness can lead to this fierce dependence on someone greater than us.
That's Paul's conclusion, is I will gladly boast even more about my weaknesses, because when I am weak, then I am strong. Because that famous incident, he has that thorn in his side and he's pleading with God, take this weakness away from me. He's fasting, he's praying, he's saying he makes 3 concerted efforts at pleading with God to take it away. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to take it away, because my power is perfected in your weakness. And that's something I think the church really needs to grapple with, is what does it look like to not only admit our weaknesses, but boast about them so that Christ's power can be perfected. And that whole thing comes at that conclusion of Paul. He gives this list in 2 Corinthians of all of his suffering. This many times I was shipwrecked. This many times I was beaten with rods. I don't think I really ever understood the significance of that until I was reading Don Carson's little book on 2 Corinthians. I can't remember the title of it now, but it's a little paperback of essays or sermons that he's given on 2 Corinthians there. And he talks about this thing they would do in the Roman world where they would basically write up their own sort of, not an obituary, but an obituary, a eulogy for themselves. And even Caesar, like they'd number it, and Caesar would be like, 3 times I did this, and 4 times I did that, and 1 time I did this, like this list of their accomplishments. And Paul is imitating that style of what great people did in his time. And he's filling the list with everything that's not great. Like, it's shameful to get beaten by rods and stoned and shipwrecked. Like, everything's falling apart, and that's what's going to make up my boasting list. And then he gets to the end of it, and I had never seen this before until reading Carson, and he points it out, but it's the very end of his list. And he says, okay, I'm going to go on being a fool, boasting about this. And he basically puts himself under oath and says, before God, I'm not lying, because what I'm about to share with you is so utterly shameful for an apostle that if I don't put myself under oath, you're not going to believe it. And then he gives this account of shortly after he's called as an apostle, he's in Damascus. And we read the story in Acts where he's let down through a window in a basket because they're looking for him in order to kill him. And we read that in Acts. And I think Don Carson says it makes for a really good, like, heroic story in a flannel graph for Sunday school. Look at brave Paul making this daring escape. And Carson points out, no, this is something he is deeply ashamed of. That's why it's coming at the end of this list of his shameful weaknesses. There was a medal, an award given in the Roman army to the first soldier to go over the wall when you're going into battle, because that takes strength and bravery. Paul's saying, I was the first one down the wall to run away when the going got tough. And so he's sitting at the super apostles conference, right? And they've got him on the panel discussion because he's kind of the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like average apostle we threw in just so people would know we're not really a celebrity conference. And the first super apostle's like, well, I exegeted every single verse of the Old Testament in my 60 years at this synagogue. And the next one's like, I've published this many books and then does this many things. And, everybody, all the young wannabe apostles are sitting in there slobbering over the achievements of these great men. And Paul it comes down to Paul, and they're like, what's this guy going to say? And he's like, guys, I ran away. And it doesn't make me any less of an apostle than you. And then he's too humble to drop the mic. So he just sits it in his chair and he goes to the green room to see if they have any more of that hummus, and that's what he's saying there.
Yeah.
And what hit me about that is like, Paul was as weak as me. He was every bit as weak as me. And that means anything he did in his amazing ministry was the strength of Christ, which means I can trust in that Christ and depend on him just like Paul did.
And that is something that I think we forget a lot of the time, is that these characters in the Bible who are always in transition, they are always portrayed as weak, even in their strengths. You see the issues with their armor, you see their weak spots. The Bible is one of the few ancient records of anything that is consistently saying, this is the Bush League part, this is the weak part. Like you read other ancient Near Eastern documents, and I mean, these people, they've got it going on. They are on point. They are not messing around. But then you read the Bible and you see weakness. And that is actually a clue to its own veracity, to its own truthfulness, is that it's not afraid to be self-aware. It's not afraid to, in a sense, not necessarily be self-deprecating, but to be honest about who and what it is. And I think for us, as we're hearing this episode and as we're thinking through this idea of weakness from a biblical theological perspective, but also thinking about it in terms of how do I live my life? In these last moments, Eric, how would you encourage us to embrace weakness?
So the very most important thing we need to see, we've talked about the saints of the past, the story of the Old Testament. We've talked about Paul's weakness, but the centerpiece of the whole Bible is Jesus, who became weak. Isaiah 53 says he bore our weaknesses. And Isaiah, as it's painting the picture, and this is something we need to grasp as Christian authors and pastors and people, and like Isaiah says, when he shows up, he appears like a root out of dry ground. Like, what does a plant in dry ground look like? It looks pathetic. It is withered up. No one looks at that plant and say, well, that plant, it has a bright future. It's going to bear a lot of fruit. I'm going to try to mentor that plant because it's obviously set for great things. And in fact, Isaiah says he had no form, zero majesty that we should desire him. From a human perspective, there is nothing desirable about the Messiah when he shows up. How can we expect to be, or think we need to be, anything greater than the Messiah on earth?
Right.
If my ministry depends on looking better than Jesus, then it's not Jesus's ministry that's happening through me. The means of the gospel going forward don't change. And the good news of the gospel, as the author of Hebrews says, is that in order to save human beings, he had to be made flesh and blood. And therefore he became like his brothers and sisters in every way, but without sin. That means he became as weak as us, except for the sin part, which means Jesus ate bad pieces of fish and got food poisoning. He ran fevers. He had limitations to what he could lift and what he could do. He got tired. He got thirsty. He got hungry. He experienced our emotions. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is so terrified by what's facing him that he's sweating possibly drops of blood because he's in such psychological torment, which, by the way, he invites his friends to see. Like, come here and watch with me.
Yeah.
And he's not afraid. And of course, even weaker than that is he becomes dead. He's hanging on a cross, and the whole world's mocking him, going, if you are what you said you are, then you should have the power to take yourself off the cross.
Right.
He's hanging there naked and shameful and then dead. And that is the moment at which Jesus says, before that, right as he's going to the cross, he says, now is the hour of my glory. Now is the hour at which I'm praying, Father, glorify yourself in the Son so that I can glorify you. He's saying now is the hour at which the ruler of this world is going to be cast out. How does he destroy Satan? How does he destroy sin? How does he destroy the grave? By this display of weakness that no other human being has ever accomplished, because he's actually dying under the curse, which is the weakest you can be. And that is where God's strength is put on display more than any other point in history. The resurrection proves that he did it, that he wasn't under sin, that the grave couldn't hold him, that Satan couldn't keep him down. And so to become strong means for us to go, I am so weak. I need that dude. I need that Messiah on the cross doing that for me. And because I have him, I don't have to be afraid of anything, because he's already guaranteed an imperishable, indestructible life for me. And I don't need the approval of the world. I don't need the approval of influencers. I don't need the approval of celebrity pastors. I don't need the approval of anything other than what God has said about me in the person and work of Jesus, who I am completely united with by faith, not by anything I've done, not by any performance I have, simply by confessing my weakness and trusting in him. I am united with him, and his life, his death, his resurrection, his future is mine by grace alone, through faith alone. That's the most important takeaway we can have from weakness.
And it's when you view weakness like that, that weakness is no longer something fearful, but it's a gift. And so, Eric, thank you so much for being with us on the Mercy Cast today.
Oh, thank you, Raleigh, for having me here. And thank you, the listeners, for putting up with my preaching. But, Jesus is awesome. We're not. Cling to him.